At the minute, we are looking at the book of Galatians, or the letter to the Galatian churches. So a lot of the New Testament, that part of Scripture is made up of communication from one person to another, from one person to a group of churches. And the book of Galatians, or the letter of Galatians, is a letter from the Apostle Paul to the churches in Galatia. Galatia is in modern-day Turkey. I thought Abby did such a great job last week, a really, really cracking job on what is a kind of difficult text. And funnily enough, Abby, who's done a couple of these talks, has had basically the two most difficult texts, just by a random sorting error, if I can put it like that. And she did a brilliant job. I'm just going to kind of recap on some of that. So Paul, the Apostle Paul, is engaged in this argument with the churches and with a group of teachers who are in those churches who want the Galatian Christians to observe Torah, to observe the Jewish law, symbolized in circumcision, in male circumcision, which we will talk a little bit more about today. Last week, we get to a part of the argument, and this is what Abby took us through, where Paul takes the story of Abraham, which is, of course, the foundational story of the people of Israel. Abraham is the man to whom God said, Abraham, I'm going to use you to bless all the nations. You're an old man, but you're going to have so many children. You're going to fill the earth. Your family's going to fill the earth. But so Paul takes this story, but he completely upends it. And of course, in Abraham's story, Abraham has two sons. One is the son of human decision, if you like. It's when Abraham was getting old and impatient, and he'd had this promise from God that his wife and he would have a child, but he was like, this isn't happening. So he has a child with a slave in his household called Hagar, and that son is called Ishmael. And the other child is the child of promise, born 13 years later, Isaac. And Isaac is born to Abraham and Sarah in their extreme old age. Now the Jews, of course, would have seen themselves in the bloodline of Abraham. So it's like a kind of real kind of Game of Thrones type thing. Who's inherited the blessing, as it were? And the Jews said it was us, because we're in the line of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. We're not in the line of Ishmael. But Paul says there is a greater theological meaning than the biological meaning. And he says followers of Jesus, whether Jew or Gentile, it doesn't really matter. They are the children of promise. They are like Isaac. They are, in fact, the true children of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And the Torah-observant Jews are theologically the children of Ishmael. Now, to do that and to kind of invert that story in that way would have been hugely offensive, actually, at the time, and subversive. And in a way, if we said that to a room full of Jews now, they would have something to say about that. So, but it emphasises the way, and this is Paul sees this as a really, really serious argument, and he's not scared of, as it were, he's not scared of pushing the boundaries of his argument. You think of it, if all this is getting already a bit bogged down in the weeds, it's like that moment in Star Wars. I mean, this might not work for you either, but there's the moment in Star Wars where Darth Vader tells Luke, I am your father. And that's the moment in which my dad told me about it, when he said, when we went to the cinema, nobody was expecting that. And everybody just went, like that. You know, it's kind of like, you're the father of that, but that does not compute. But that is what Paul is doing. He's completely swapping around our expectations of the situation. And then, at that point, Paul invokes what is a pretty dark episode in the history of the people of Israel, where Sarah demands that Hagar and Ishmael are cast out of the household. Then in verse 30 of chapter 4, Paul says, what does Scripture say? Get rid of the slave woman and her son, for the slave woman's son will never share in the inheritance of the free woman's son. Paul is all the time contrasting these ideas of slavery and freedom, this kind of binary. And he's saying, choose freedom. And he's also saying, throw out, reject those that want to enslave you. So he's saying the same thing about these teachers that Sarah said about Hagar. Throw them out of the house. Don't let them in. Send them on their way. And he's doing it in a pretty disruptive way. And then he gets to what is arguably the rhetorical peak of this whole letter, where the stories, the kind of argument's been kind of layering up and has been taking them up a kind of mountain, as it were, and it's getting higher and higher and higher. And then at verse 1 of chapter 5, he says this: "It is for freedom that Christ has set us free." It's for freedom that Christ has set us free. Because the gospel is all about freedom. And following Jesus is all about freedom. And being a Christian is all about freedom. And being part of a church is all about opening ourselves up to greater and greater levels of freedom, which is, of course, the very opposite of what people think. Because people think that church and religion and all that kind of thing is a kind of impingement on their freedom. But Paul says, to our complete surprise, it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Christ came to make us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened by a yoke of slavery. So there's this word in this text which is kind of very, very kind of present, and that word is freedom. And what does that mean? Because everybody wants it, and everybody likes the idea of freedom, but no one can really agree what it is. All cultures and societies think of themselves as free, and the truth is that all cultures and societies are free for the privileged. But for those who that society isn't set up for, they're not free. That's true of every society. Now, my boys, two of my children, have taken to watching these semi-educational videos on YouTube called, what are they called, Becca? Oversimplified. So they're these kind of oversimplified versions of historical events. Like, this is the Napoleonic Wars in 15 minutes. So they're called quite funny, animated videos. And they were watching one the other day on the American Civil War. There was this kind of little joke in it about Thomas Jefferson, who famously wrote the American Declaration of Independence and wrote these words into it: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." So we've all heard those words before, right? Thomas Jefferson, a slave owner. He owned hundreds of slaves in his life. He was a humane slave owner in comparison to many others. And he did want an end to the slave trade, although he was a kind of gradualist. He was saying, "We've got to do this slowly, slowly." And it's true also that he wanted to write a clause into that declaration to say slavery is bad. But eventually he removed it because the southern states were objecting. So the point is, like, we all celebrate freedom, we all celebrate the idea of freedom, but actually achieving it and knowing what it is, that's a different matter. Freedom is a complicated thing, even for us, and we might be tempted to see ourselves as the exception. No, we are truly free, but no, we're not. I mean, we're pretty free, but we often think of freedom in very narrow economic terms, don't we? We think of freedom as choice. That's our kind of working definition of things. We were walking to lunch yesterday. We had a Mother's Day lunch yesterday, not today. And Abraham, it was Ernest, one of the other kids, asked me that age-old question: "Dad, what would you do if you won the lottery?" And it struck me that is fundamentally a question about freedom. Once all the kind of boundaries are gone, once you can do whatever you like, what do you do? But it's a kind of economic version of freedom. So we think of freedom as kind of maximum choice and as much choice as we can have, and choosing about all parts of our lives and making choices all the time. The truth is, sometimes we get really tired of making choices for our lives. Another truth is that we don't think of the way our desires are shaped all the time. So we think we're choosing freely, but no, we're just choosing something that an advertiser put in our head. And another truth is that we don't think of the ways our freedoms depend on the unfreedoms of others. We only need to think about the climate crisis to recognise that carbon-heavy lifestyles have a cost that we, generally speaking, won't end up paying. But people in other parts of the world, in more vulnerable situations, they'll pay the cost for our freedom. So there's this idea that Paul offers up, but whatever he means, I don't think he means what we think of freedom. So we're going to read these verses and then try and get to the bottom of it. So Galatians 5, 1 to 15. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. Mark my words. I, Paul, tell you that if you let yourselves be circumcised, Christ will be of no value to you at all. Again, I declare to every man who lets himself be circumcised that he is obligated to obey the whole of the law. You who are trying to be justified by the law have been alienated from Christ. You have fallen away from grace. For through the Spirit we eagerly await, by faith, for the righteousness for which we hope. For in Jesus Christ neither circumcision nor uncircumcision has any value. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. You were running a good race. Who cut in on you to keep you from obeying the truth? That kind of persuasion does not come from the one who calls you. A little yeast works through the whole batch of dough. I am confident in the Lord that you will take no other view. The one who is throwing you into confusion, whoever that may be, will have to pay the penalty. Brothers and sisters, if I am still preaching circumcision, why am I still being persecuted? In that case, the offence of the cross has been abolished. As for these agitators, I wish they would go the whole way and emasculate themselves. Yes, he does say that. You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free. But do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Rather, serve one another humbly in love. For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command: love your neighbour as yourself. If you bite and devour each other, watch out, or you will be destroyed by each other. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
What time is it? We're conscious that we... 15 minutes, I think, if I can see that clock rightly, to work through this. So, I'm going to talk about the problem of freedom, and then I'm going to talk about a model of freedom, and then I'm going to talk about the practice of freedom, so what it means to, how we experience a lack of freedom, who we look to kind of model freedom, and then how we can practice freedom in our daily lives. But we don't have much time, so let's crack on. So Paul in these verses is playing a lot, as I've said, of these binaries, like freedom and slavery. And he's very, very clear. And this you all have, I don't know, maybe picked up when I was reading those verses. Like, in a sense, Paul is all over the place in these paragraphs. There are metaphors jumping out all over the place, and he's being entirely inconsistent. And it feels like behind this text is someone who's very, very concerned and arguing very passionately and kind of bringing all the guns to bear, if that's not a distasteful analogy. The core of it, and the thing which we have to kind of hold on to as we navigate our way through this, is that he's talking about a choice between freedom and slavery. The problem of freedom is the problem of wanting to be free. As I've said, everybody likes the idea of being free, but very often we find ourselves trapped in unfreedom. And whenever the Bible talks about freedom, including in Paul's words here, you have to have in your mind the central freedom story of the scripture, and that is the Exodus, which is God's liberation of people from slavery in Egypt. You may all know something about that. You know, the kind of Pharaoh takes them, and there's 10 plagues, and there's kind of this kind of struggle, and eventually the Pharaoh releases the people of Egypt, and God's power has been demonstrated, and off they go, and then they go through the Red Sea. Pharaoh changes his mind, chases them, etc., etc., etc. But then they end up in the desert for 40 years, still in a kind of unfreedom. So they're liberated from Egypt, but they're not in the Promised Land. They can't go to the Promised Land. Because why? Because even in the story, it's clear that freedom is not a simple thing. So they're politically free, but once they're exposed to the risks of freedom and the kind of threats of freedom, it turns out that they yearn for the security of slavery. Even though God is literally with them, the presence of God literally goes with the people of Israel, in a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. The presence of God literally guiding them. But the moment, do you know what it is? It's the moment they get hungry, and then they say, and I would be exactly like this as well, at least in Egypt we sat around pots of meat. You know, at least, I know we were slaves, but at least we had lunch every day. You know, at least we had 3 square meals. So it turns out, and this is so true of the biblical narrative the whole way through, that it is easier to take people out of Egypt than it is to take Egypt out of the people. It's easier to take the people out of Egypt than it is to take Egypt out of the people. So the people are habituated into this life. And just so with the Galatians on a kind of spiritual level, they have had and experienced the ultimate freedom of being called by a God who completely loves them. But then they've started to kind of toy with this kind of what Paul calls in the first verses of this letter, an alternative gospel or a gospel in reverse. They've kind of started to back their way up the track into Torah observance, a form of unfreedom. And last time, this is actually the second sermon that I've titled kind of Freedom, but this is Freedom 2.0. And I said this, like, just the picture is something like this. Imagine a child, or imagine 2 children, and one child is completely confident that they're loved and valued. Their parents would do anything for them. They are cared for, they are nurtured, they are encouraged. And now imagine another child that is looked after, but maybe not kind of neglected anyway, but constantly critiqued. You know, when they're a little kid and they colour outside the lines and the parent says, I've done this to my children. It's not very good, is it? It just shows you how inept they are. Or they're compared to others and they're not as good as those other children over there and all that kind of thing. And when their homework isn't perfect, then they absolutely know about it. And that's how the parent sees their role. Now, which of those children do you think will play more and laugh more and draw more? Which of those children do you think will play a musical instrument? Which of those children will take risks in their kind of life of employment? Which of those children will be more turned outwards towards loving their neighbours? Which of those children will take the risk of and hard work of learning the language in a desire to communicate with other people from another culture? And I think that's a kind of picture that Paul is painting. You are a loved child. And you have the status of loved children. And you should have the ultimate freedom of knowing that the God who created the universe utterly loves you. Or it made me think of those words from the prophet Hosea. I led them with cords of human kindness, with ties of love. To them I was like one who lifts a child to the cheek and bent down to feed them. If that is how God sees you, well, that's a game changer. But that's not the kind of voice they're listening to. They're listening to those that tell them that they don't yet have the status as dearly loved children, that they need to do something else, that God is not content with their faith in Jesus, that they need to do something more, perform some extra thing. And in this case, it's Torah observance. So Paul's words are, in Galatians 5:1, is stand firm, just stand in it. Stand your ground on that. Brace yourself on that truth against the headwinds and the things that are trying to push you over by a message that's trying to say, no, you need to do something else. Paul's saying, stand firm. Just keep steady in it. God loves you and know that you're a dearly loved child. And then he gives a kind of corresponding sort of chilling warning. He says, if you let yourself be circumcised, Christ would be of no value to you. If you go down the route of Torah observance, then you'll be alienated from Christ, is another thing he says. And then he says, later on, a little bit later on, you'll have fallen away from grace. And in 3 different ways, Paul is actually saying something which we found deeply scary, that it is possible to reject and ultimately lose and fall away from the grace of God. You can lose it. You can lose it. Paul says it. And it's true, there's probably an element of, he is at this point kind of really arguing hard, so there's an element of kind of hyperbole, but I don't think he's exaggerating. I think he's being extreme because he thinks there's a real danger for the Galatian churches and for the Galatian Christians, and he's so stressed about it. And of course, he uses some really visceral language here. Basically says there, I wish these guys who are advocating circumcision would go the whole way and cut their. I can't even say it. He does say that. That's exactly what I mean. And by the way, he's kind of using the language of cutting in all the time. Do you notice he says, you were running a good race, you were doing so well, but then somebody cut in on you. They're cutting, all these cutting puns that Paul is doing. But he's basically worried that they're going to lose everything. They're going to lose that state of grace in which they live. And fall away from grace. Such a frightening idea. It's been like they're on a tall cliff. And they've been put there by the power of God. Nothing about what they've done. Nothing about their believing. But they've just been put there by the grace of God. But if they don't mind how they're standing, and if they're just wandering around at the top of the cliff in a mindless way, then they're going to drop off into this abyss of unfreedom. And that is I do think that's a chilling thing to say, is that actually we can fall away from God's grace. He can try and sort of hold us there, but if we are kind of determinedly sort of trying to jump off the cliff, then we can fall away from grace. Now, there's a gulf here, because as far as I'm aware, nobody here is kind of challenged around or being taught by anybody or exposed to any teaching, which is basically saying you need to be a Torah observant, circumcised individual to be within the grace of God. Correct me if I'm wrong, and we need to talk about that if you are. But, that's not the problem that we have, explicitly. But we do have a problem. As Abby mentioned last week, often we think it's exactly this stuff, this kind of faith stuff that we've got to cast off in order to be free, and it's an enemy of freedom. And religion can be used to manipulate and control, and therefore that's what we need to do is free ourselves from religion, and then we'll be free. But it's not that easy. Like freedom, again, it's complicated, it's hard. I was reading a book recently by a guy called David Zahl. Really recommend this book. It's called Seculosity. And it's about how even though we might get rid of formal religion, that those kind of instincts are still part of us. And he says, because religion in real life is more than a filter or paradigm. Religion is what we lean on to tell us that we're okay. And that could be anything. Is what we rely on to tell us that we matter. And it's another name for all the ladders we spend our days climbing towards a dream of wholeness. It refers to our preferred guilt management system. Our small r religion is the justifying story of our life. Ritual and community and all that other stuff come second. And he's saying we all have these justifying stories of our lives. We all do that all the time. Even the most sort of self-professed atheist has something, a ladder that they're trying to climb towards a dream of wholeness. And in that book he also talks about enoughness. He says this, listen carefully and you'll hear the word enough everywhere, especially when it comes to the anxiety, loneliness, exhaustion and division that plague our moment to such tragic proportions. You'll hear about people scrambling to be successful enough, happy enough, thin enough, wealthy enough, influential enough, desired enough, charitable enough, woke enough, good enough. We believe instinctively that, were we to reach some benchmark in our minds, then value, vindication and love would be ours. And that if we got enough, we would be enough.
Paul's argument all along is that the only enough that you need is the enough of Jesus. So we were singing about that this morning. The only enough that you need is the enough of Jesus, and it is a profound liberation. There is freedom when we can say to all those things, when we can say to success and happiness and thinness and wealth and influence and desire and charity and politics and all of that, we can say, the only enough that I need is knowing that I'm a loved child of God. That's enough for me. Paul is wanting desperately to ensure that they do not let go of that enough for some slave-driving ladder towards wholeness that ultimately will fail them. So this is as much our problem, I guess I'm saying, as it is the problem of the Galatians. I'm going to rattle through these next 2 points. So that's the problem of freedom. The model of freedom. Where does Paul look to? And where do you look to? Where do you look to? Who are you looking to say that person models a kind of life and a kind of wholeness of life which I admire, and I would love that. I would love if I were like that. In verse 6, Paul says, "For in Christ Jesus neither circumcision nor uncircumcision has any value. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love." You take that little phrase, faith expressing itself through love, and all the commentators agree that Paul is basically saying the same thing that he just said about Jesus a few chapters ago. So in chapter 2, verse 20, Paul says, "The life that you see me living," and he has in his mind that the Galatians are kind of watching him and seeing what actual life he's living. How does Paul do this? What is he doing? And maybe with a cynical eye. "The life that you see me living is not mine, but is lived by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me." So the only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. And who do we see modelling that? Jesus. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. The Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. One of the commentators, N.T. Wright, in his commentary on Galatians says, "If that is what we most securely know about Jesus, then those who are in Messiah Jesus are to be marked out in the present time by the same character. You can tell," he says, you can tell a Christian, you can tell the Messiah people, because they are small working models of what we might call Messiahness. They are faith through love people. And our model is it's like, I was thinking of that old hymn, "Fix your eyes upon Jesus." I can't remember the words. And everything else will go strangely dim. There is something about, it's like a Sunday school thing. What's the answer? Jesus. How do we model freedom? Jesus. Jesus was free. Was he always at liberty? Clearly not. Was he wealthy? Clearly not. So think, who is that person that you have in your mind and think, I just wish I could live like them? If it's anybody but kind of Jesus, and this is the flip that we have to make, because the model in our mind of freedom doesn't fit Jesus. Jesus in lots of ways looks unfree. Jesus was killed by the Roman Empire. It's not a great expression of freedom. But there was something about who Jesus was and where he stood, the ground he was on, the groundedness of his life, that meant he was not under the power, ultimately, in the end, at all, of course, of the Roman Empire or of the Jewish religious authorities. So who is your model of enoughness, the kind of security that leads to freedom? Is it Jesus? And here we see that freedom is not that you can do whatever you want. It's being secure in your loveness, your faith acting itself out through love for others. I don't have time to talk about this, but one of Paul's big things in this letter is he's really interested in church unity And that's not a fashionable concern these days. We just all want to kind of build our own churches and think we're the best and we're great. But for Paul, there is one people, one status, no separate class. All these people, this Messiah people, this single Messiah people, characterized by one thing, faith working itself out in love. You want to know what a good church is, then you better go and find a church that has people full of faith working itself out through love. So that's the model of freedom, and then the practice of freedom. In verse 13, you, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free, but do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. I mean, this is a really essential point, is it? But it's simple, but again difficult. Serve one another humbly in love. The entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command: love your neighbour as yourself. And this is a kind of crashing paradox. Like, if you've been following Paul along, he's been saying, don't follow the law, don't follow the law, don't follow the law. And then he says, but the law is fulfilled in this, and this is what you need to do too. Love your neighbour as yourself. The very moment that Paul is completing this argument of freedom from the law, he roots them back in this. Be law-fulfilling people. Love your neighbour as yourself. And whatever freedom we have, we're invited to use it to serve other people. Again, like flowing in completely the opposite direction to the current of our culture, which says our freedom is about your individual capacity to achieve your desires. So let's land this thing in a couple of minutes. We have to ask, in response to this, what is our enoughness? We have to ask that question. What is our sense of enoughness in our own individual lives? David Zahl's book is actually subtitled How Career, Parenting, Technology, Food, Politics and Romance Became Our New Religion and What to Do About It. And if none of those things, if parenting, technology, food, politics, romance, none of those things are your thing, then you fill in your blank. And Zahl says, look to where you are most tired and most anxious. That is where you'll find your standard of self-justification. The point at which you're thinking, if I get that right, then I'm okay. And the point is that everybody's doing something like that. And the problem with that is that they are all harsh masters, because we never meet the standard. And the point of Jesus is that we don't have to. It's all by grace. And we have this situation where, unlike the Galatians, we're not like, the point about circumcision is that it's the symbolic act of entering into community. And for a Christian, we have to say, what is that moment? That moment is our baptism. That's when we say yes to Jesus. And that's the moment when something, whatever your theology of baptism is, when we express, when we symbolize the moment when we say yes to all this, and I am part of that. And you cannot put that together with circumcision. Now, our situation isn't that. Perhaps we're not falling off a cliff. Perhaps we're not falling away from grace, but perhaps we're just walking away from grace. Perhaps we're just walking down the hill. But we don't need to do that, because our enoughness isn't based on anything that we can do for ourselves. So freedom isn't an unrestricted freedom of choice, but it's about our grounding. It's about saying our enoughness is found in the grace of God. We don't need to be enough, because He is enough. And do you know that you're loved? Do you know that you're cherished by the Creator of the universe? And I know that actually, in a way, knowing that on one level is not enough. Like hearing that fact reported, and particularly if you've been around church for years, it's kind of like, yeah, that's what every preacher always says. But do you know it? Is it that kind of knowledge that goes from there to there? And when it is, we won't just have a freedom from all those anxieties of our lives. We won't just be able to get off those ladders that we're trying to climb to wholeness. But we'll be able to be free for something else, to do other things. Paul says, through the Spirit we await for a righteousness for which we hope, saying, Like God's new creation is breaking into our reality and we're waiting for it. And in our lives right now, we get to be at play. And we get to be kind of anticipating that with our whole lives. And saying, I'm free from those things, but not just free so I can feel better inside. I'm free from that so I can participate in whatever God's doing and say yes to that without fear. Without fear that there won't be enough money. Without fear that I'll lack kind of the good opinion of others. By the way, isn't that the worst master ever? The good opinion of others. We'll be free for service. And that will be a beautiful thing. And that little thing that we did today was handing out a few flowers. What about if that was just like a daily thing of just blessing others and reaching out to others and just offering them Jesus, not in a kind of, sometimes in unspoken ways, but often in spoken ways as well. It's for freedom that Christ has set us free. I better stop there. I wonder if you would all stand with me for a moment. We're just going to pray to close. And wait on God's presence.